Alafia. First, I want to thank you. My name is Oyasuru Ifawarinwa. Most people who know me call me Farinwa. They seem to find that easier to say. What you've shared today are some of the secrets that we carry in our bodies throughout America and certainly throughout this side of the Atlantic. The infection of that other way of being in the world that suggests that everything is either or, and that there is a right that stands above all other things. Just as the culture of African origination has sort of infused and interacted with other I will call them earth-based spiritualities and religions, just as that has emerged into this sweet thing, so we also have been infected with a notion of, well, all of the isms, misogyny. I'm trying to figure out a way that we can extract that thing. It almost feels cancerous in its approach to cultures, and part of the way that works is to remove the languages that carry the cultures that teach what you've been trying to teach and sharing very effectively today. Losing the Yoruba language, which has no gendered pronouns. Infusing the idea that there is a supreme more important than the others, when you just described the deities that all have their roles that fit together, just like we all are a human forest, working together, feeding each other. Does your work include trying to take that hegemonic view of language out of even our own, even people who express and love the more natural view of the world, regardless of their race? How do you take that stuff out that would turn it into just another way to oppress people? That's my question for you. And it's one you don't have to answer, but I'm hoping that you're working on it. And thank you for sharing your mother and dreams.
Thank you, Sister Fadila, for your question. That's a very important one. And as you were talking, several things came to me. I may not be answering it directly, but hopefully what I say will resonate a little bit with what you're looking for. I spent the first 10 years of my initiation in Candomblé working with my parents in the Veterans of Hope Project. And so it's only been for about 11, 12 years that I have had a tenure track position at the University of Colorado. And one of the things that I noticed is how absolutely essential it is for me to return as often as possible to the ritual spaces and the sacred community of Candomblé. And the way I think this connects to what you're asking is that I think what Afro-Atlantic religions offer and what we have to have if we are really going to live and to embody a transformed meaning of humanity and society, we have to do that more than, 2 hours a day, or kind of just in the intellectual spaces of our minds. Ritual is such an important and healing resource in the lives of all human beings. And I think that's part of why earth-based traditions, indigenous traditions, have such importance of ritual in their communities, because whatever ritual it is, whether it's the ritual of getting up and brushing your teeth in the morning, or the ritual of honoring ancestors, honoring the rich and splendid multiplicity of being in the world, whatever you do on a regular basis gets into you, gets into your mind, gets into your spirit, gets into your body. And it's interesting, because even though I teach these religions in various ways all the time, I'm thinking about them, I write about them, I find that a lot of the hegemonic assumptions of the academy that I thought would never touch me just get in there, because that's where I'm doing, that's where I work, that's where I spend so much of my time. And so I have to be very conscious, and I'm fortunate in that way, because I have a job that, will pay for me to go to Brazil at least once a year, and I spend my own money to go again, and I bring my elders and teachers here to the States so that I can stay connected. I don't want to go on too long, but one of the things that you asked reminded me of how significant my mom's presence was in my life. She passed in 2004, and before then, I felt like, as I mentioned in the lecture, that just being in her kitchen, being in her presence, was like an extension of the Candomblé community for me. And once she passed, I really had to be much more conscious about how I found and made and cultivated a sense of that alternative community for me here in the United States. So I would just say that I think we have to be really intentional about living in, making the structures of our lives, our schools, our families, our work experience, bring that much more in tandem with the understanding that we recognize as real in the world. Because our bodies are so simple. We're basically just vibration, human beings, right? So if you can say, all you want about gender equality and about anti-racism or whatever, but if you're living in a context that does not feed that, then your body and your mind are going to be impacted. And so the question is that, and I'm not answering, but I'm agreeing with you, how do you create that in a situation where you're surrounded by these hegemonic damages and distresses? And that's where I think Afro-Atlantic religions really do have something to teach us. And I'll just say very quickly so we can go on. I think part of the reason the Southern Freedom Movement, for example, was able to rise with such extraordinary power from the mid-50s to the mid to late 60s in this country was because African-American Christianity at the time, which is not the same as this prosperity gospel mess that's happening now, but the traditional mystic African-American Christianity provided that space for this alternative understanding of a human, so that Black people had a place to rise and model and move from. And we have to have those versions for this moment in our history in order to continue forwards.
I just told you that you raised today.
Oh yes, that's my dear elder sister. I love her. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My name is Jay Atkinson. I'm a research scholar at Starr King. When you mentioned Ruby Sales' name, I flashed back on a session at the AAR maybe 4 or 5 years ago, in which she, as part of a panel, raised a question. She said we need to look deeply and ask deep questions about the current functionality of the academy. And I think a lot of what you have said today raises questions for me about how really dysfunctional large segments of the academy are, because they are unrelated to people's real concerns. And this is a struggle that I've had as with one foot in the academy and one in parish ministry over my own career. And so I just wanted to thank you for raising that question about the excessive hegemony of the academy in a lot of our lives, and the way that it really contributes very little to meaningful human life and the ways that we try to live it more fully. So, not a question, but thank you.
Thank you, Brother Jay.
I'm Antonia Apolinario Wilcoxon. I'm not a student at this wonderful school. I'm very grateful to President Rosemary and Dr. Gabriela and the team to be here today. I spent some time with students. I'm very grateful for your message and for the affirmation that you bring to people like me. I grew up in the favelas of the city of Rio, which is south of the state. Each time I go to Brazil, I need to go to Salvador as well, because that's where I am fed. It would be just serendipitous that I'm here today and I'm able to listen to your message. Thank you so very much. My mother was a devotee, and in Brazil we like to say Catholic by day and by night she practiced, and we didn't only learn about her practices after her death, but she raised us in what you so beautifully described. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so much an honor for me and Irma Antonia that you're here with us. Thank you very much.
I'm Nancy Palmer Jones. I serve the congregation in San Jose. I'm going to go home and try to write a sermon about integrity. I'm going to try to draw on what sources and resources and centering draws out of me my best integrity. And so much of what you said resonates so deeply with my own spirituality and my own core humanity. And yet, I'm anxious about, of course, if I were to name what I've heard and learned here today, I would certainly talk about its sources and about you and about where all these things come from. But I'm concerned that even drawing on it, I think even drawing on it, I risk colonizing something that doesn't completely belong to me. And so could you just speak to that? And I'm really fine with wherever you go with this.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Nancy. Let's see, I have a couple of thoughts. And maybe let me start with one that I was mentioning at the breakfast table with three sisters who were sitting with me and talking. I was telling them about a number of things, but one about my dad, who, in addition to this mama's mama exercise that he and my mom would use in their classes, my dad taught at the Isla School of Theology, in Denver, Methodist connected seminary, where probably like Starr King, the majority of the students were white. And were white people who were not always sure about how they felt with their ancestry, Sometimes felt like they were maybe trying to move away from things that they associated with their ancestors' histories. So my dad had one way of addressing this and my mother had another, and I'm going to suggest both as just an example of some of what you might want to work with in the context of your pastoring. So my dad used to teach that because we are all connected, because we are all ultimately family, and that, you know, that in some ways people might think that's kind of a platitude, but it's actually true. You know, we are all of us who are living today descendants of the original African mother from the Great Rift Valley, someplace in East Africa, who, you know, over many, many millennia, if you take the scientific, you know, way of understanding this, sent all her children out to the rest of the world, but we all, in some measure, share, if we go back far enough, a familial connection. So if you assume that, what my dad used to say is that you can choose your ancestors. You know? And it's very important, I think, in some ways, particularly in our society, for white folks to know that there have been some magnificent ancestors. People like Clarence Jordan and Anne Braden and John Brown and the Grimke sisters. I mean, there's just lots of folks that, unfortunately, and we understand the reasons why, because they don't feed the hegemonic narrative of white supremacy and racism. But there are lots of folks that we need to know about, and we need to create rituals and celebrations of them and their energies and their blessings, and call them into the spaces and ask for their help and ask for their guidance. So that's one thing that my dad, I think, would suggest. My mom's side, she helped me when I was growing up. My grandmother, my father's mother, lived with us, but for whatever reason, I wasn't as close to her as I was to my mother's mother, who actually lived in Chicago. And when my paternal grandmother passed, I was feeling, you know, not settled with the fact that I didn't feel like I had resolved my relationship with her before she passed. So my mom told me, she said, you know, Rachel, we can heal our relationships with our parents, grandparents, with our ancestors, even after they're on the other side. You continue to have a relationship and you can heal that relationship. So she gave me some things to do and some prayers and just some affirmations and ways to start to work on my connection with my grandmother. And it took some time, but I began to have the most extraordinary dreams of Mother Harding, my father's mother. And in recent years, as I have gone through some particularly distressing kind of personal challenges, I felt with absolute certainty that it was she, among all of my ancestors, all of whom I talk to all the time, but it was Mother Harding who came and stood with me and just kind of gave me an extra sense of protection and encouragement and got me through the distresses. And that was after doing what I needed to do to just let her know, I'm sorry that it ended, you know, the way that it did, and I wanted us to be and want us to have a beautiful, the best relationship that we can have. Come to find out she wanted it too. So I'm just saying that it's possible. So there's both those ways that we're all connected, and so your ancestors can be from all kinds of places and all kinds of people. And among those folks who are in your blood lineage, who for whatever reasons you know, think you have difficulties with, keep working with them. Keep working with them, keep talking with them, because they are growing and changing also, even where they are now.
I think we have, we'll be able to do two more, because we're going to start running over, and we'll do a little bit of Starr King time, but we do want to make sure there's enough time to have lunch. And thank you, Dr. Harding, for naming Clarence Jordan. He's definitely an ancestor.
Oh, yes. He was my godfather.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Joseph Santos Lyons. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister based in the Philippines. So I come from Manila this week. And it feels like the whole world is in trauma and is on fire. And I really appreciate the wisdom you shared. And I also really appreciate the note that you made early in your remarks around the co-creation and exchange with other cultures, particularly Native American cultures. Do you see a continuation of that work today with Afro-Atlantic religions? Do you see that sort of continuation of exchange and co-creation with other communities of color?
Oh, that's a great question. Brother Joseph is your name? Okay. Well, yes, in the sense that, as I was saying during the lecture, the religions of African origin here in the Atlantic are, by the nature of this historical and contemporary context, multicultural and multiracial, because Black people coming from West, Central, Southern, East Africa encountered people here. You know, whether it was white folks or whether it was Native folks, and depending on where they were, sometimes even people with Asian roots. So, and what's interesting about many of the Afro-Atlantic traditions, certainly Candomblé, but I think I know as well about similar things that have been occurring with the Vodun tradition and certainly with Cuban traditions as well. These are religions that, by and large, are open to whoever the Spirit sends. They are not proselytizing religions, but they are initiatory religions. So in a sense, they are practices where you don't choose the God chooses you. And if God sends whoever to the community and through divination, it's determined that this person needs to be here, then this person needs to be here. So that, I'm saying that to say that even within the structure, within the formation of the religions and within the way that they operate in the contemporary spaces of this hemisphere, there is already a lot of multiracial presence in almost all of the traditions. In fact, I was reading not too long ago that here in the United States, the fastest growing group of Vodun initiates are Euro-American women. And in Brazil, in the larger cities of Rio and Sao Paulo, for example, there are lots of folks who identify as along the wider scale of Brazilians, even Asian Brazilians. So that's one part of the answer in terms of just how the religions function. They are spaces that tend to gather and hold multiracial communities because of a kind of an essential openness to that. But the other part, in terms of conscious kinds of interfaith conversations or connections with other indigenous traditions, is something that I see a bit more often in individual cases. I know have other colleagues, both people who teach these religions in the academy, as well as practitioners who have friendships and connections with Native folks. Denver is a remarkable and I think a wonderful place in that sense. I would imagine that the Bay Area may have some similar patterns, but there's some wonderful connections among Lakota folk African Americans, Chicanos, particularly around people who are looking at the indigenous roots of their practice and identities. But that's something that I think we need as much of as we can get, and I share your excitement and desire for it. So there are some aspects of kind of multiracial connection that just have to do with the way the traditions function and tend to be open to all kinds of folks. But this other question of a more intentional kind of conversation across indigeneities is beautiful and healthy, and I think something that we need to do more and see more of.
I want to follow up on to ask about a subject that is of great import in Unitarian Universalism right now, and that's about the issue of cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation. And I was happy to hear you say that there is this notion within the Afro-Atlantic world that God chooses you. Yeah. So, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think I've lived long enough to watch people who are not native to a tradition decide that it's theirs, and who don't feel respectful to me, and we are trying to raise up future religious leaders who can navigate that space. So I would really welcome any thoughts you have on that.
Okay. Well, first let me say, Rosemary, that knowing the way my mind works, I'm going to have some more thoughts about this in about 48 hours. But I recognize and share your concern, at the level. It's complicated. It's complicated. And I always, I guess, in a way, whenever I'm not sure, how to respond to something, I go back to my mama and daddy and try to think about, what would they say to that? Or what did I see them do? So what I'm going to say right now is just kind of what comes to me of what I witnessed from my folks. But as I have other thoughts, because it is a concern, and so we can talk about that some more. So my parents met each other in the Mennonite church in the early 1960s, late 50s, early 60s in Chicago. And it was through the Mennonites that they then moved to Atlanta, Georgia as the first leaders, African-American leaders of a Mennonite social service project, which again is a whole nother lecture. But so where I'm going with this is that at a certain point in their lives and in the life of our family, at various points actually, I saw my parents beautifully, elegantly, kind of, I don't want to say straddle, but walk these parallel paths. So they, from the time I was very little until both of them passed, these were people who maintained an extraordinary and profoundly genuine vision of the incredible potential that exists for this country to be a healthy, just, multiracial nation. That, in some ways, it feels like that was the dream of their heart, the dream, the collective dream of their spirit. It was one of the things that held them together as a couple. And at the same time, I think, recognizing the nature, the profound nature of racism, white supremacy, anti-blackness in this country, they also knew how important it was for people of color to have these spaces where our souls could be fed and protected and cared for in ways that just could not happen now in this society that we're living in, even as we move to create a space that is healing and honoring and welcoming for everybody. That's a complicated thing to try to get our minds around, and I'm also glad that you asked the question, because I think I really want to and need to think about what that means and what that looks like. But at this point, I just have to say that, you know, from the model of these two of the people, probably the two people who I honor and admire most in my life, that's what I saw them do. I saw them, you know, it's almost like that reciprocity and balance idea, you know, back and forth. And they're not contradictory. They're not contradictory in this society. In fact, in order to continue to have the strength to keep searching, to keep pushing, to keep working with our white brothers and sisters, they had to come back and have times where they could feed those most vulnerable and tender places of their hearts. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but okay.
When you gather your thoughts, can we have Symposium Part 2 in 48 hours? Let's extend our gratitude to Dr. Hardy.